So here we are trying to summarize Eastern religions, and maybe I summarize is the wrong term. The idea is we want to get a sense for them, try to contextualize them in a way that maybe um, we can understand them in a way that's easier for us to hold on to and grasp. And I had you read an excerpt from a book written by a particle physicist, Prof Capra. And Capra was a physicist over at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and he lectured at various universities. What he found, or what he noticed, was that what he learned about the nature of particles, what he learned about quantum mechanics, sounded very similar to what he had heard from being exposed to Eastern philosophy and Eastern religions. And this was what he wrote about in this book, The Tao of Physics. What we focused on for this week is the sections in the text where he summarizes or he sees similarities amongst the various Eastern traditions that we've looked at in our class thus far. So what did he notice? Well, he noticed that amongst these religions, in particular Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism, there was an emphasis on mystical experience. And we're going to define mystical experience. Actually, we'll define all of these similarities in a second. We'll just list them out for now. He discussed how they all three seem to have an emphasis on intuitive and experiential knowledge versus knowledge of fact or propositional knowledge. He noticed that they all seem to acknowledge the limitations of language. And we noted this every time there was a religion that spoke about the ultimate. They would always preface this by saying, the ultimate is beyond words. We can't speak of it, right? So he also noticed that these three religions seem to have an emphasis on unity and how everything seemed to be connected in some way. You can see that with Taoism, how everything is this natural pattern, how everything belongs to this natural flow. Or we can see this in Hinduism, where everything is Brahman. There seems to be this underlying idea that everything seems to be connected, that everything is one in some way. All three, he claims, seem to have an emphasis on reality being dynamic, that there's a process at work here, that the universe is an ongoing, unfolding sort of thing. You can talk about how in Taoism, right, the Tao is this pattern, is this flow of things. We can talk about Buddhism and how the Buddha believed that nothing stays the same. One of the truths, one of the marks of existence is that things are continually in flux, continually changing. And he also noticed that amongst these three religions, there seemed to be the sense that we need to liberate ourselves, free ourselves from a belief in a finite, small self. That's a limiting belief that we have. Okay, so let's take a look at each of these individually. So the emphasis on mystical experience. So what's a mystical experience? In order to understand mystical experience, we have to get a sense for what consciousness is. So if you've taken a basic psychology class, consciousness is broadly defined as everything you are aware of in an instant, anything that you are conscious of. So right now, you may be conscious of the images on your computer screen. Hopefully, you are conscious of the words and the sounds I am making. These are things that you can be aware of. There's a certain type of consciousness we call waking consciousness, and this refers to our normal, everyday, organized, alert sort of awareness. This is what we say is happening to us when we're walking around, being aware of where it is we're going. Right, we are participating in waking consciousness, and this is in contrast to what people often refer to as altered states of consciousness. So altered states of consciousness just broadly means anything other than waking consciousness. Now, some of the more obvious forms of altered states of consciousness are when you're asleep, right? When you're asleep, you do not have your normal, clear, organized, alert awareness. When you're dreaming. When you're intoxicated, you may not have your normal, clear, organized, alert awareness. So when we talk about mystical experiences, we're talking about these altered states of consciousness. We're thinking about states of consciousness that aren't what we refer to as normal, clear, organized, and alert. And what people will often say is that they are having an experience of being in some sort of divine presence, or they are in communion with something significant, something greater. They'll say things like, I lost myself. It seemed as if I kind of blended in or melded in with this ultimate in some sense. So we kind of lose our sense of identity. Sometimes people with these sorts of experiences will claim that what they experienced in those mystical states it felt more true, it felt more real. And they'll often mention how they felt as if they actually knew. There was a deep sense of knowing that occurred when they're in these mystical states, as if there was some sort of truth or like a direct understanding of something that they couldn't fathom in their normal waking state. When we take a look at various religions, we see that many of the founders seem to have been in these sorts of states. Within Hinduism, we're told that the Vedas come from these individuals called rishis, right? Seers. So they have these unusual, extraordinary experiences where they're able to see these truths or experience these truths. The Buddha is said to have attained enlightenment. There was an altered state of consciousness that occurred when the Buddha was sitting under the Bodhi tree. So, second thing that Capra brings up is this idea that within these Eastern religions, there's an emphasis on experiential knowledge. So to understand the divine, to understand the ultimate nature of reality, there's a focus on actually experiencing it, not just thinking about it theoretically, right? Except for maybe Jnana Yoga. But there's an emphasis on like doing, on feeling. So the type of knowledge we're talking about here is knowledge how, right? It's a knowledge of how to do something, how to live your life in a certain way, in a quote unquote better way. The Buddha talks to us about the need to be mindful, the need to experience the self as not existing, the need to experience a release from grasping, a release from selfish desires. And this is in contrast to often the approach to knowledge we often see in the West, where instead of focusing on knowledge of experience, like how to ride a bike and the experience of riding a bike, the emphasis in the West is oftentimes declarative knowledge or knowledge of whether or not a statement is true or false. So to clarify the difference, you can know certain facts about a bicycle. You can know how many wheels they have. You can know how many speeds a certain bicycle has. You can know the weight of a bicycle. You can know certain facts about the bicycle. You have certain beliefs about the bicycle. That's declarative knowledge, propositional knowledge. Within the East, we see focus not on necessarily that type of knowledge, but more of an emphasis on experiential knowledge. You have an acquaintance with the feeling of riding a bike. You know what that experience feels like. So as we went through the various Eastern traditions, you might have seen this, or if not, you should look back and see if you can identify this, where the emphasis was on experiential knowledge. How to be in the world as opposed to what to think about the world. We talked about limitations of language. One way to think about this is to think about an experience that you may have had, but other people you know have never had, never have. Let's imagine baseball. Let's imagine you've never experienced baseball. If somebody were to explain to you what baseball is, they would have to use terms that you are familiar with. And because you are not familiar with baseball, you are not familiar with the language of baseball. So the terms that somebody would use may not make any sense to you. Somebody may say something like, there is a pitcher that throws a ball, and there is a batter who uses a bat to try to hit the ball. If you're not familiar with baseball, those sentences may sound really weird. A pitcher, like a pitcher of water? Throwing a ball at a batter? Like, is there a guy with wings? What do you mean a batter? Is there a guy trying to make cookie dough? What do you mean by batter? And then you tell him, well, no, this guy hits the ball. He runs to first base, and he tries to make it home. The person listening to tries to comprehend those sentences. He runs to first base, like a military institution, a military facility. When he's running home, why would you leave the game? Why would you go back home? So you can see that language is limited. Language can only convey so much information, especially if you are a person not familiar with these terms or not familiar with the experience being conveyed by the language. So with Eastern traditions, they seem to acknowledge this. They seem to acknowledge that the experiences that we are trying to convey, they are limited. Language is limited in its ability to convey the experience. So then how do you know about what these religions are teaching? Well, the religions say you experience it, you try it. You experience what the world would be like if you thought of yourself as one with all of reality. You experience what the world would be like if you were able to think of yourself as not really permanently existing through time. Right? You experience what it feels like if you believe that the world seemed to naturally flow, that there's a natural pattern to everything. Right? Within Taoism. So, what sorts of truths then are being espoused by certain individuals that have these sort of mystical experiences of reality? What sort of truths are these religions trying to get across to us? Now, what I mean by that is that anytime you learn something about a religion, there's lots of different ways of trying to process that information. There's lots of different ways of interpreting the beliefs or the language of experience that these religions are sharing with us. You could treat these very spiritual. You could treat them as relating to some sort of spiritual dimension of life. But you can also treat these as maybe talking to us about some sort of physical, cosmological reality of existence. More popular is you can think of these as philosophies. You can think of the philosophical truths being espoused here. Maybe these various mythologies aren't telling us about some sort of extra dimensional reality, but are telling us about new perspectives on how to look at ourselves in relationship to the world. And even more popular is a psychological perspective. Well, maybe these religions and what they're telling us, maybe their mythologies, are really about what it means to be a human being, what it means to interact and get along with other people. So let's take a look at some examples. So within the Eastern traditions, here are some very key concepts to the three main Eastern traditions we talked about the past half of the quarter. They all emphasize a sort of unity and interconnectedness of all things. They all emphasize how reality is dynamic, right? How things are constantly changing. And as we mentioned earlier, they emphasize this notion that we should be liberating ourselves, or we should free ourselves from believing we are this small, confined ego. So spiritual truths, maybe these are really referring to some sort of spiritual truth of reality, that there is some sort of underlying or maybe overarching spiritual dimension to reality in a very metaphysical way, maybe. And many people believe this, right, based upon possibly stories they hear about afterlife and possibly stories they hear about near-death experiences, or maybe they've had mystical experiences and they see or experience what they believe to be a spiritual dimension of reality. Lots of different reasons for this. Maybe they're referring to physical truths, cosmological truths. Now, what could this mean? Well, if we think about this notion that everything's connected, that everything is one, we kind of see this when we take a look at the physical relationship between animals and plants and the ecosystem. We see that everything is kind of in a balance, all kind of connected. Or if you destroy certain wildlife, you destroy or you make extinct certain creatures on the planet, there seems to be an imbalance and a change to the web of life. And in this sense, we are all interconnected. In this sense, there is a unity there. Maybe this is what these religions were referring to. But obviously, back in the time period, they didn't have this concept of web of life. They didn't really have a concept of ecosystem. At least they didn't have those terms. So maybe the terms they use, those are the best terms they had to try to relate to us the truths that they experienced about life on the planet. Maybe it's referring to a different type of physical truth. What's interesting is when we take a look at quantum mechanics, we take a look at some of these really interesting sorts of discoveries, we notice that particles, even though they are far away from each other, seem to be connected. You do something to one particle, and it seems to have a simultaneous effect on the other. That seems odd, because if I put something on one side of the room, I put something on the other side of the room, it seems to be the case that there's two different things. What I do to this shouldn't necessarily happen to this. They're separate entities. That's kind of how we look at reality. We look at reality as made up of separate stuff, right? Tables, chairs, people, computers. Well, what we see with quantum mechanics is that these two, that particles seem to affect one another at a distance. This might show that there is an interconnection between everything. Maybe there is an underlying unity to all things that we're just not aware of. Maybe this is the type of truth being espoused here by some of the religions that we just didn't really get a sense for what this meant until we discovered some things about quantum mechanics. Who knows? This notion that everything is in flux, that everything is dynamic, well, maybe this too is talking about the fundamental nature of physical matter. Because when we take a look at physical matter, all things are made up of atoms. And all these atoms, they make up these various molecules. And even though this thing looks solid and still, it's actually a constantly flowing, constantly moving collection of molecules and atoms. It's just that from our perspective, it looks like it's completely solid and still. But the closer and closer and closer you get to looking at what's in here, we see constant dynamism, constant movement, constant change. And actually the same thing is true of the universe, right? Science has this idea that the universe is constantly expanding, right? Which is kind of a strange notion when we think of the universe as meaning everything, right? Universe equals all that is. Well, now physicists tell us, no, the universe is actually expanding. So in both of these sorts of examples, we see reality as being a non-static thing. It's a very dynamic, ever-changing sort of phenomenon. Maybe this is what the Asian traditions, the Eastern religions were trying to tell us. You can think of these as philosophical truths. Maybe these concepts relate to how we are supposed to see ourselves, or give us a perspective on how to see ourselves in relationship to all of reality. One way to relate to this is to think of ourselves as like leaves on a tree. The leaves on a tree see all the other leaves and have the sense that they're all separate leaves. But if you take a look at the bigger picture, they're not really separate leaves. They're all the tree. They just all have this sense that they're separate if they look at each other from a certain point of view. But from a broader point of view, no. These things that believe that they're separate are actually just part of one thing called the tree. And in fact, when we take a look at the origins of a tree, we can say they all come from a seed. But wait a minute. Is the seed different than the tree? Is the tree a separate thing than the seed? Or is the tree really just the seed in a different form? The seed after time has elapsed. There's no reason why we shouldn't think the tree is the seed just at a later point in time, right? Well, let's take a look at ourselves. We have this sense sometimes that we are kind of on the planet. We kind of live on the planet, but really, aren't we made up of the same stuff that makes the trees and the mountains and the dirt? Aren't we dirt stuff? Don't we come from the earth? Instead of saying that we are on the earth, isn't it more appropriate to say we are the earth because we're grown out of the earth? Aren't we as much the earth as a tree, as a mountain? Maybe the Eastern traditions are pointing to this sort of perspective, this sort of philosophical viewpoint of our relationship to nature. Even more interesting is that when we take a look at the universe, we have this theory that it began with this giant explosion, and everything seems to expand from that explosion. And then we believe we're kind of a creation of this explosion. But if you really think about it, when did the Big Bang end? Well, the universe hasn't stopped expanding. So in a very real sense, we are still in the Big Bang, which means if you're thinking about who we are, if the leaf on a tree is the acorn, then aren't we then the Big Bang itself? Maybe this is the sort of philosophical perspective being espoused by these religions. How might we treat ourselves differently or treat each other differently, treat the planet differently, if we had this sort of philosophical perspective? That we are one. We are this thing that we refer to as the universe. We are this thing that we refer to as the Big Bang. Maybe this is something to think about when we reflect on what it means to reconnect with Brahma. But how about psychological truths? Well, if we think about it, the idea of liberation, the idea of freeing ourselves from a finite ego, it's a very psychological sort of thing. Not to get too trapped in selfish desire, not to get too trapped in stories we tell ourselves of who we think we should be. The way to navigate through life as maybe having to let go every once in a while, and not trying to over control stuff as we see with Taoism. Maybe these are psychological truths, truths that tell us about how our mind works and how to best live in a world considering the type of mind we have. So religions can be interpreted in lots of different ways. You could take them literally. You could take them in terms of how they relate us to some sort of spiritual dimension, or you can take them and see what sorts of truths they have in these other sorts of avenues, psychology, the physical nature of reality, philosophically speaking. Okay? So keep this in mind when you're trying to process and digest the Eastern traditions, and this might help you better relate to the movie that you'll watch for your midterm. Okay? Good luck. I'll see you next time.